We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a blessing and gift from God. Ruth 1 depicts how a person can feel starved for things other than food. Elimelech and his wife, Naomi, flee a famine in Bethlehem and settle in Moab where there is plenty of food, and their sons find devoted wives. Within 10 years, however, Naomi's husband and sons are dead. When she hears Judah has food again, she prepares to return as an old, bitter widow. One daughter-in-law, Ruth, insists on accompanying her. On the surface, a young Moabite widow in Israel would be the last person who could help, but God honors Ruth's loving kindness and eventually uses her to restore Naomi's hope and future. Our first verse says, "When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there." Naomi hears that the famine in Israel is over. She can go home. It will be humiliating to return to her hometown only to ask for charity, but the despair and bitterness she feels with the loss of her family is even worse. It's natural that, at first, her daughters-in-law would be expected to go with her. The implications of returning to Israel are different for the younger women than they are for her. It will be hard enough for an older Israelite widow to return to Israel. 2 young Moabite widows will be vulnerable to much more than starvation. Verse 7 says, "With her 2 daughters-in-law she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah." Orpah and Ruth, Naomi's daughters-in-law, clearly love her deeply. At first, it seems perfectly reasonable to Orpah and Ruth to stay with Naomi. As they approach Bethlehem, however, it seems Naomi realizes that these young, unprotected Moabitesses will face hardship and even danger in Israel. They will be seen as outsiders, even enemies, unlikely to find husbands on their own, at risk from cruel men and with no other family to rely on. Verse 8 says, "Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me.'" The closer Naomi gets to Israel, the more she realizes how difficult life will be for pagan, widowed, Moabite women to live in Israel. And as a widow herself, there is nothing Naomi can do to protect them. Naomi makes the hard choice to tell them to return to their birth families so they can find new husbands who will care for them and can give them security and a family. Orpah and Ruth had stronger family ties in Moab than they did with Naomi, so it made sense for them to stay in Moab instead of going to a new land, Israel, with Naomi. Naomi is releasing the women from all obligation to her. She sent them away, in hopes that God would deal as kindly with them, as they had dealt with her and her family. At this point, they had all left Moab and was on the way to Judah. Naomi was fully aware of the prejudices and problems of a Moabite living in Israel. Verse 9 says, "May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye and they wept aloud. Even though Naomi is bitter towards God for the loss of her husband and sons, when it comes to blessing the women she loves, God is all she has. There is something in Naomi's heart deeper than resentment, and both Orpah and Ruth would have seen it. She was probably different from the Moabite women they know. Her God was certainly different from the idols of the Moabites. Their crying and emotion shown, is evidence of the real relationship of love between Naomi and her daughters-in-law. Verse 10 says, "And said to her, 'We will go back with you to your people.'" What Naomi suggests is a permanent separation. The younger women prefer to stay with Naomi and go to Israel with her. Naomi refortifies her argument and she hoped that Orpah and Ruth would remain in Moab, remarry and have someone provide for them for the rest of their days. What then, is the Bible's definition of rest, as we can see from here. It is more than sleep, but carries with it the idea of peace and security, and the ability to cease from labor and toil. Verse 11 says, "But Naomi said, 'Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons, who could become your husbands?'" Orpah and Ruth, refuse. They love Naomi and want to stay with her. She fights them with logic. The only way, she thinks, they can have rest but stay in Naomi's life is if Naomi has more sons for them to marry. Sadly, Naomi has passed the age of childbearing. In that era, the likelihood that anyone would want to marry a woman too old for childbearing is very slim. If Orpah and Ruth stay with Naomi, they will not have rest. If they remarry, they will not be family. Verse 12 says, "Return home, my daughters, I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons." This continues Naomi's heartbreaking logic. She loves her daughters-in-law and does not regret that her sons' wives are Moabitesses. But there is no reason to expect a future for them if they stay with her. Naomi has already pointed out that she is too old to bear more sons for them to marry. In fact, she is too old to remarry to even try to have sons. Even if she could have sons, the younger women would need to stay with her until those sons were grown enough to marry. Would they? The expected response is, of course not. Orpah and Ruth need husbands now, while they are young enough to start their own families. Verse 13 says, "Would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Finally, even if she got married that very night and gave birth to sons 9 months later, would Orpah and Ruth wait until the boys were old enough to marry? It's much better if they separate now. Naomi's view of God is tragic. She thinks his hand, his authority and power has gone out against her. In her mind, God has intentionally, directly acted to harm her, as he would to punish someone in rebellion. She's even further grieved to think that the two women she loves most have been caught in the crossfire. Naomi did not want them to suffer the same bitterness that she felt she was experiencing. She hoped that God would show them kindness if they were away and apart from her. Verse 14 says, "At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her." Naomi's argument hits home. She sees no way her daughters-in-law can stay with her, and yet be free from hunger and poverty. Orpah is convinced. She loves Naomi and doesn't want to leave, but she agrees there is nothing a Moabite widow can do for an Israelite widow living in Israel. She returns Naomi's kiss and returns home. Orpah was rational, and responded to Naomi's logic. In fact, her pragmatism was also a form of obedience to the words and desires of someone she loved and respected dearly. Orpah tearfully, finally agrees to leave. Unlike the modern world, goodbyes such as this were usually permanent. Once the women move on to new lives, they have no reason to expect to ever meet again. For some reason, Ruth is more resolved. As Ruth sees it, there is nothing to discuss, she is staying with Naomi. Verse 15 says, "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." Naomi continues to try to convince Ruth to return to Moab. She uses peer pressure, noting Orpah's departure. Naomi tries to convince her to follow Orpah, who has gone back to her people and to her gods. Naomi's return and Orpah's departure was not merely one of returning to community and family. Yet Ruth clearly understands the implications of her choice. Verse 16 says, "But Ruth replied, Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go I will go, and where you stay I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God my God. Why then, would a Moabite woman whose Israelite husband had died insist on leaving home to follow her mother-in-law back to Israel? They have no man to protect them, provide for them, or hold their land. Their choices to earn a living are begging, servitude, and prostitution. Despite all this, Ruth will not leave Naomi. In fact, Ruth adds to her vow. After living with Naomi's family, Ruth is satisfied with Yahweh, the God of Israel. She will not return to her parents and seek a Moabite husband. She will follow Naomi to Bethlehem. Naomi's husband sold their land. Ruth will lodge on the streets if that's where Naomi is. She will reject her own people and claim the Israelites, no matter how hostile or dangerous they may be toward her. And she will worship Yahweh as her God. Verse 17 says, "Where you die I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Ruth finishes her vow to Naomi. The young Moabite widow will not leave her widowed Israelite mother-in-law no matter what. If Naomi is going to go home to Bethlehem, Ruth will too. If Naomi lives in an inn or a relative's house, or the street, Ruth will too. Ruth formally, passionately disowns her people and her gods and claims Israel as her people and Yahweh as her God. Even more so, if Naomi dies in Bethlehem, Ruth will not leave her. She will live out her years near Naomi's grave and be buried with her so that, in the understanding of the culture of the time, they can remain family in the afterlife. She swears this in the name of Yahweh. She understands the cost, and she is willing to pay it. And if she breaks this promise, she calls on God to strike her down. Verse 18 says, "When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her." Naomi fought hard for what she feels is best for Ruth, but now accepts that she's lost the argument. Having lived with Ruth for years, Naomi probably knows when it's futile to try to change the woman's mind. Before long, Naomi will come to realize God didn't abandon her when he allowed her husband and sons to die. God gave her Ruth. Within a year, Ruth will find a man who is willing to redeem Naomi's husband Elimelech's property and bear a son in Elimelech's name. Naomi will have her son through Ruth. Ruth will have a good husband and everything else Naomi wishes for her. In addition, 2 generations later, Israel will have a godly king in Ruth's great-grandson David. And finally, the Messiah, Jesus, Matthew 1:5-16. Our final verse says, "So Naomi returned from Moab accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning." The narrator completes the first chapter of the story with a synopsis and setup for what happens next. Naomi has returned to Bethlehem without her husband and sons. Her widowed daughter-in-law, Ruth, insisted on accompanying her. Bethlehem means house of bread. The name makes the famine even more tragic, but the famine makes the barley harvest even more cause for celebration. The barley harvest occurs around late April or early May and continues until the wheat harvest 2 weeks later. Because of the barley harvest, Ruth will meet Boaz. Because of Ruth's devotion to Naomi, Boaz will insist Ruth continue to glean through the wheat harvest. By the end of the wheat harvest, God will redeem the losses the women have faced and bless Israel and the world in the process. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.